A millionaire thought he could escape his past, but what happened on his wedding night shattered everything. Who was the mysterious woman who turned his life upside down? Stay tuned, because the shocking truth will leave you speechless. You won't believe how this story ends. The millionaire sat in the lavish ballroom, eyes glinting with anticipation. His friends surrounded him, laughing, drinking. A strange bet had been placed. He, a man of wealth, would marry the ugliest beggar in the city. At first, he thought it was a joke. But then, the beggar appeared. Old, hunched, clothes ragged, face covered in grime. The crowd fell silent as she was led into the room. She stood there, trembling, barely looking up. He could feel their eyes on him. The man felt a thrill. He was marrying someone far beneath his station. It would be humiliating, a victory for him. He stepped forward, a smirk on his lips. He took her hand, forcing a smile. The beggar's skin felt cold, rough, like leather. Her eyes were empty, lifeless. Her fingers clung to his hand with a grip that sent a chill down his spine. They exchanged vows quickly. His thoughts were elsewhere, already planning his escape. The crowd cheered as they sealed it with a kiss. It felt wrong, unnatural. Her breath, hot and sour, against his lips. They retreated to the private chambers for the night. He dismissed the servants with a wave. The door closed, locking them in. The air in the room was thick, suffocating. He glanced at her, standing in the corner, unmoving. His eyes darted around, searching for something to focus on. He had everything in the world, except peace. Her presence felt heavy. He sat on the edge of the bed, his heart racing, uneasy. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice trembling with impatience.
She didn't respond.
A silence so thick it stung. The floor creaked as she stepped closer. A faint odor clung to her, a mixture of dirt and something more unsettling. She stood before him now, her face hidden beneath the layers of dirt. Her hands trembled. He could see the outline of her eyes through the filth, dark and hollow. Then, in a quiet voice, she spoke. "Do you think I am the beggar?" she whispered. His stomach churned. Something about her voice felt off. He looked up, but her face was still covered. His fingers twitched. "Yes," he said, forcing the words out. Her hand reached up slowly. She pulled away the grime, revealing her face. His heart stopped. The woman before him wasn't ugly at all. Her features were soft, graceful, almost angelic. But it wasn't just her beauty. It was the eyes. He knew those eyes. He had seen them before. On a woman he had once loved, years ago. His blood ran cold as the truth began to settle in. The woman standing before him now was no beggar. She was someone he had forgotten, someone he had wronged. Her lips curled into a smile full of vengeance. The room seemed to shrink, the air suffocating. She leaned in, her breath now sweet. "Do you remember me now?" she asked softly. The man's body stiffened. The truth hit him like a fist. The beggar was his past, come back to haunt him. But now, she was no longer a beggar. She was something far more dangerous. And the real game was just beginning. The man's pulse quickened. His mind raced, trying to connect the dots. But the pieces didn't fit. He stared at her, his thoughts tangled in confusion. Her smile was calm, almost serene. But there was a darkness in her eyes. The kind of darkness that can only come from years of pain. "How?" he whispered, barely able to form the words. Her smile grew wider, colder. "Do you think you can bury the past and it will stay there?" she murmured. He shook his head, trying to make sense of the situation. No, it couldn't be her. The woman he had wronged was long gone, lost to time. But here she was, standing before him, looking the same, yet not the same. The edges of his vision blurred, and he felt the walls close in. She took a step closer, her presence suffocating. Every breath he took felt heavier, like he was inhaling the very weight of his sins. She reached up, slowly, deliberately. Her hand brushed his cheek. He flinched at the touch, but he couldn't pull away. The warmth of her hand contrasted with the chill that had settled in his chest. "Do you remember the promises you broke?" she asked softly. He couldn't speak. Her words struck him like a knife, carving through him. Memories flooded back, memories he had tried so hard to bury. She had been the one he left behind, the one he had forgotten. Her pain, her heartache, he had caused it all. And now, here she was, standing in front of him, not as a beggar, but as a woman who had nothing left to lose. He opened his mouth to apologize, but the words stuck. She wasn't waiting for an apology. She wasn't waiting for anything. Her hand slid down his neck, resting on his chest. The heat of her touch was overwhelming. "You will pay for what you did," she said, her voice low, dangerous. And in that moment, he realized the bet had never been about humiliation. It had been about vengeance. The room seemed to darken, the air thickening with each passing second. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond. Her grip tightened around his chest. And in that instant, he knew he was trapped. The woman before him wasn't just a victim. She was his reckoning. His breath caught in his throat. Her fingers dug into his chest like iron, her grip unyielding. The air in the room became dense, thick with a suffocating pressure. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. His body felt paralyzed, frozen in place. She leaned in closer, her breath warm against his ear. "You thought you could escape the consequences," she whispered. "But there is no escaping what you've done." The room seemed to shrink around him, the walls pressing in, the ceiling lowering. Everything felt heavy, like the weight of years of guilt had come crashing down on him all at once. He tried to speak, to apologize, but his voice was gone, swallowed by the force of her presence. Her lips brushed against his ear, sending a shiver down his spine. "I've waited for this moment," she continued, her voice soft but chilling. "I've waited for you to understand, to feel the weight of your betrayal." His heart pounded in his chest, each beat louder than the last. The darkness in her eyes seemed to consume him, drawing him in, pulling him under. And then it happened. Her hand moved from his chest to his throat, wrapping around it with terrifying strength. He gasped, struggling to draw in a breath, but it was no use. She wasn't choking him, not yet. She was simply holding him in place. Her touch, though gentle, felt like a vice. "You took everything from me," she said, her voice now cold and distant. "Now you will know what it feels like to lose everything." The room spun around him, the walls blurring as the pressure in his chest intensified. He tried to scream, to fight, but his body wouldn't respond. His vision started to darken, the edges of his world fading into shadow. But just as he thought he might lose consciousness, she loosened her grip. The air rushed back into his lungs, but it felt heavy, thick with the weight of her words. He gasped for breath, clutching at his throat, his chest heaving. The woman stepped back, watching him with a cold, unfeeling gaze. She had him, body and soul. "You've already lost," she said, her voice emotionless. "You just don't know it yet." And with that, she turned and walked toward the door. As she opened it, the light from the hallway spilled into the room, stark and harsh. Her figure was silhouetted in the doorway, a shadow of vengeance. "I'll be waiting," she said, her words lingering in the air like a curse. The door clicked shut, leaving him alone in the dark room. The silence that followed was deafening. He sat there, trembling, his heart still racing. The weight of her words pressed down on him like an iron shackle. He was a man trapped by his past, by the choices he had made. And now, there was no escape. There was only the reckoning. The silence in the room felt like a physical presence, oppressive and cold. He could still hear the echo of her words in his mind, each one a dagger twisting deeper. "I'll be waiting." The door, now closed, seemed like a barrier he could never cross. His fingers trembled as he reached for the glass of water on the bedside table. But his hand was unsteady, his nerves raw. He couldn't calm himself, couldn't shake the sensation that something far darker was unfolding. He stood up, but his legs felt weak, as if they might give way beneath him. His mind raced, replaying the moments before, her touch, her words, her presence. Everything about her had been familiar, but also so terrifyingly new. And then, the realization hit him again like a cold slap. He had wronged her. He had betrayed her. In a desperate attempt to gather his thoughts, he walked to the window and peered outside. The city lights flickered, distant and lifeless, like stars far beyond his reach. He tried to focus, to ground himself in reality, but his thoughts spun wildly. The woman he had wronged, she wasn't just seeking vengeance. She was something more. The years of pain, the years of loss, he could feel them, suffocating him. What had she become in all that time? What had she turned into? And, most terrifying of all, what would she do next? He closed his eyes, rubbing his temples, but the images of her face, her cold smile, wouldn't fade. In that moment, he realized how much of his life had been built on lies. How many people had he left behind in his pursuit of wealth, of power? How many souls had he trampled over, unaware of the consequences? And now, one of those souls had come back, not for revenge, but for something darker, something more terrifying than he had ever imagined. He spun around, pacing the room, his thoughts spiraling. He couldn't run from this. There was no way to undo the past. But maybe he could try to make things right. A strange idea started to form in his mind, a plan that felt as dangerous as it was desperate. He had to find her. He had to confront her. But what if it was too late? What if there was no redemption for him? The room felt colder now, the darkness pressing in around him. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps outside the door. His heart skipped a beat. He wasn't alone. With slow, deliberate movements, he moved toward the door, his body tense with anticipation. He didn't know what he was walking into, but he couldn't stay in this prison of his own making. He opened the door, his breath catching in his throat. And there she was, her figure barely visible in the dim light of the hallway. She looked different now, darker, more powerful. The woman he had wronged stood before him. And this time, there was no escape. The door creaked open slowly, and his heart raced faster with each passing second. Her silhouette loomed in the hallway, a shadow against the dim light. She was still, but everything about her radiated a kind of stillness that felt unnatural. Her presence was suffocating, like the air itself had thickened around her. He swallowed hard, but his throat felt dry. "Why are you here?" His voice cracked, barely more than a whisper. Her lips parted, but it wasn't the words he expected. Instead, her eyes pierced through him, darker than before. "Do you really think it's over?" she asked, her voice low, almost a growl. His knees felt weak, like they might give way at any moment. He took a shaky step back, but she was already inside, the door snapping shut behind her with a finality that echoed through the room. He didn't know what to expect, but his mind was filled with visions of her wrath. She had come for something, but what? Her gaze moved across the room, inspecting the fine furnishings, the opulence, the wealth he had built. But her eyes were not on the material things. No, they were fixed on him. The millionaire felt his stomach twist, nausea rising. "I've spent years thinking about this," she said, her voice steady but laden with venom. "You took everything from me, without a second thought. And now, you think you can run?" He staggered backward, his heart hammering, but there was nowhere to go. Her words stung like a whip, cutting through him with sharp precision. "You're wrong," he said, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and defiance. "I'm trying to make things right." She chuckled, a cold, hollow sound that sent a chill down his spine. "Make things right?" She stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "You don't get to undo what you've done."
Not now.
Not ever. He could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him, each one a reminder of the sins he had buried deep within. Her gaze never wavered, her presence like a force of nature, impossible to ignore. He felt small, insignificant in the face of her resolve. She reached out slowly, and he flinched, expecting pain. But instead, her hand brushed his cheek. It was a delicate touch, but it felt like an electric current running through his skin. "You think you can make amends? That you can walk away from all of this?" she whispered. He didn't know how to respond. He felt powerless, trapped in the web she had woven around him. Her fingers lingered on his skin, the warmth of her touch sending a strange shiver down his spine. And in that moment he realized something. It wasn't about him making things right. It was about her making him understand the cost of what he had done. She had no intention of letting him walk away. Her lips barely moved as she spoke again. "It's not enough to say you're sorry. You will feel the weight of your actions. Every single day." The words were like a curse, sealing his fate. His mind reeled, trying to process it, but it was too much. He couldn't escape. Not from her. Not from his past. The room felt colder now, and the darkness seemed to close in. It wasn't just the woman he had wronged. It was the past he had buried, the choices he had made. And now, they were coming for him. His breath hitched, his mind scrambling for any way out, but the walls of the room seemed to tighten around him with every passing second. Her hand stayed on his cheek, the warmth of it now feeling like a cruel reminder of everything he had lost. Her eyes, dark and unblinking, locked onto his with a coldness that froze him in place. He couldn't look away. It was as if they were pulling him into a deep, empty abyss, one he could never escape. She took another step closer, closing the distance between them. He could feel her presence suffocating him. "Do you know what it feels like?" she whispered, her breath warm against his ear. "To be discarded like trash? To be forgotten?" His throat tightened, but he couldn't speak. He was frozen, paralyzed by guilt and fear. She reached up, her fingers tracing his jawline, her touch gentle but unrelenting. It felt like a slow burn, like every nerve in his body was awakening to the reality of what he had done. He had thought he could live his life without facing the consequences. He had been wrong. "You built your empire on the backs of people like me," she continued, her voice rising slightly. "And now, you'll see what happens when you think you can just leave us behind." His chest felt tight, suffocated by the weight of her words. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move. It was as if the very air in the room had turned to lead, pressing down on him with an unbearable weight. She stepped back, her eyes still locked on his. Her smile was cruel, a twisted mockery of what should have been a gesture of kindness. "You thought you could win, didn't you?" she asked, her voice soft, almost pitying. "But you don't get to win. Not anymore." He swallowed hard, trying to form words, but nothing came out. She was right. He had thought he was in control, thought he had won. But now it was clear. He had been nothing more than a pawn in her game. And she had played him perfectly. The air in the room seemed to crackle with tension, an electric charge hanging between them. He could feel her gaze on him, as if she were watching every move he made, every breath he took. His legs felt weak, and he stumbled back against the wall for support. He wanted to run, to escape, but he knew it was pointless. She wasn't just here to confront him. She was here to make him understand, truly understand, the depth of his sins. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the darkness closing in on him. But it was no use. Her presence, her voice, her touch, they had already consumed him. She took a final step back, her figure framed by the dim light from the hallway. The silence between them was deafening, thick with the weight of everything unspoken. And then, she spoke again, her voice quiet but filled with finality. "You can't escape your past. No one ever truly does." Her words hung in the air like a haunting refrain. She turned and walked toward the door, her footsteps soft but sure. As she opened it, the light from the hallway spilled into the room once again, harsh and unforgiving. Before she left, she paused at the threshold, her back still to him. "I'll be waiting," she said, her voice low and steady, the promise lingering in the room long after she was gone. And then, the door clicked shut. The darkness swallowed him whole. The room felt emptier now, as though her presence had left a vacuum that was slowly suffocating him. The weight of her words echoed in his mind like a drumbeat, relentless and unforgiving. His chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, but every breath felt heavier than the last. He was alone now, but not truly alone. Her words, her touch, they lingered in the air, a constant reminder of everything he had done. He stumbled toward the bed, his legs unsteady, his mind in turmoil. His hands gripped the edge of the mattress, his knuckles white with tension. How had it come to this? How had a simple bet turned into something so much darker, so much more suffocating? He could still hear the soft click of the door closing, like the final seal on his fate. But it wasn't just about the bet anymore. It wasn't just about the woman he had wronged. It was about everything he had built, the empire of wealth, the shallow victories, the broken promises, and the price he was now paying for it all. Every decision he had made, every person he had crossed, was now coming back to him, and he couldn't escape it. The silence in the room was deafening, thick with the weight of his guilt. He sank to his knees beside the bed, his face in his hands, overwhelmed by the realization that there was no undoing it. No amount of money, no grand gesture could change the past. And as much as he wanted to escape, to run far away from the consequences, he knew it was too late. She had said it clearly. You can't escape your past. Her words weren't just a threat. They were a truth he couldn't deny. He could feel the walls closing in again, the darkness threatening to swallow him whole. The man tried to steady his breath, but each inhale felt like it might be his last. His vision blurred, and he could feel the tears burning at the corners of his eyes. He had never felt so small, so insignificant. His empire, his wealth, they meant nothing now. They were just empty things, symbols of a life built on nothing but lies. And as he sat there, consumed by the weight of it all, the door creaked open again. His heart skipped a beat, but when he turned around, there was no one there. The air felt colder this time, a chill that cut to the bone. He stood slowly, his legs trembling beneath him. And then, he saw it, a figure standing in the doorway, not her, but someone else. A face he hadn't expected to see, a face that sent a jolt of recognition through his veins. It was another woman, but this one was different. Her expression was hard, almost cold, but there was something else in her eyes. Something he couldn't place. She stepped forward, her footsteps echoing in the silence, her presence just as overwhelming as the woman before. "I think you've been waiting for me," she said, her voice low, steady. And with that, the second reckoning began. The air in the room seemed to shift, the weight of the moment pressing down even harder. The woman's figure, silhouetted in the doorway, held an unsettling calm, as though she knew exactly what he was feeling, what he was going through. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest, every instinct telling him to run, to escape whatever this new presence was, but his legs wouldn't move. The woman stepped closer, her heels clicking against the floor with precision, each step deliberate. Her gaze never wavered from his, cold and sharp, like a blade slicing through the fog in his mind. "You're wondering who I am, aren't you?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper, but filled with an unsettling power. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words stuck in his throat. Who is she? Another person from his past? Another victim he had overlooked? But no. Her eyes, there was something in them that was all too familiar. "You thought you could walk away from everything," she continued, her voice steady, without a hint of emotion. But you've underestimated how deep your mistakes run. The room felt even colder now, the walls pressing in like they were closing on him, each breath he took heavier than the last. The woman took another step forward, and he took a small, hesitant step back. His body moved on instinct, but his mind was spinning. Who was this woman? What was she going to do? She stopped a few feet away from him and smiled, a thin, sharp smile that didn't reach her eyes. You think you can escape your past, but it's always going to catch up with you, she said, her words chilling him to the bone. Her voice was strangely familiar, but he couldn't place it. His hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the bed again, trying to steady himself, but it was no use. I don't know who you are, he managed to choke out, though the words felt hollow, meaningless.
But I didn't.
She cut him off with a single, swift motion. Her eyes narrowed, and the intensity in them made his throat tighten. You didn't what? She asked, her voice now rising with a sharp edge. You didn't realize the consequences of your actions? You didn't see how many lives you crushed in your path? Do you think this is all just going to disappear because you're sorry? The words hit him like a hammer. He staggered backward, his head spinning. He had made so many mistakes, hurt so many people, but it wasn't just about one wrong. It wasn't just one betrayal, it was a lifetime of them. His empire had been built on the suffering of others, and now, as the walls of his past closed in around him, it felt like it was all crashing down at once. Her eyes were burning into him now, each word cutting deeper into his soul. You don't get to make things right, she said, her voice quieter now, but no less intense. You don't get to fix it. Not after all the lives you've ruined. Not after everything you've done. The room seemed to tilt, the floor feeling unsteady beneath him. His hands gripped the edge of the bed harder, as if it could somehow anchor him in this nightmare. But the more he tried to steady himself, the more the weight of her words overwhelmed him. His mind raced, but there were no answers, only the realization that the consequences of his actions had finally found him. And this time, there was no escape. The woman took one final step toward him, her presence like a storm closing in. And as she reached out, her fingers brushing against his arm, he felt the coldness of his past gripping him tighter than ever before. The woman's touch sent a sharp jolt through him, like a cold current running straight to his bones. He recoiled instinctively, but her hand didn't move. It stayed there, firmly gripping his arm, cold but unyielding. The room felt like it was closing in on him, the walls contracting with every breath he took. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion, guilt, and fear. He had thought he could outrun this. He had thought he could bury it, that the weight of his wealth and success could protect him from the ghosts of his past. But now, standing before this woman, this stranger who somehow felt more familiar than anyone, he realized how wrong he had been. You can't outrun it, she whispered, as if reading his thoughts. Her voice was low, but it carried an unmistakable weight. Not from the people you've hurt. Not from the life you've destroyed. His knees felt weak, as though they might give way beneath him at any moment. He looked up at her, his vision blurred by the crushing weight of regret. I didn't mean to. I didn't know, he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were empty. Excuses. Pleas for forgiveness that could never undo what he had done. You think saying sorry will fix it? She scoffed, her eyes cold and piercing. You can't just erase the damage you've caused. You can't make it go away, because you want it to. Her words were like a slap in the face, each one harder than the last. She was right. He had spent his whole life thinking he could buy his way out of trouble, that money could protect him from the consequences of his actions. But now, in the face of the woman he had wronged, perhaps even unknowingly, he realized just how hollow that belief had been. Your empire, she said, her voice filled with disdain, is built on broken people. And those pieces will never be whole again. He closed his eyes, unable to look at her anymore. His empire, his entire life, felt like a facade, crumbling in front of his eyes. With one final, lingering glance, she let go of his arm and stepped back. "You can't fix this," she whispered. "But you can face it." And with that, she turned and walked toward the door. It creaked open, and the light from the hallway spilled into the room, harsh and unforgiving. She paused for just a moment in the doorway, her figure bathed in the stark light. "I'll be waiting," she said softly, before disappearing into the darkness beyond the door. The room fell silent again, but the silence was different now, heavy with truth. He stood there, alone in the darkness, facing the enormity of what he had done. There was no escaping it, no running from it. He had nowhere left to hide. The room was still. The echo of her words lingered, a constant hum in the back of his mind. "I'll be waiting." The door clicked shut behind her, and the silence that followed felt heavier than anything he had ever known. He stood there, frozen, his eyes fixed on the empty space where she had been moments before. The world outside, the life he had built, it all felt so distant now, irrelevant. In the stillness, his mind replayed everything. The choices, the chances, the lies. He had built an empire, yes, but at what cost? His heart felt heavy, burdened by the weight of his own actions. He thought he could escape. He thought he could outsmart the consequences. But now, all that remained were the echoes of a life lived in pursuit of things that didn't matter, things that had only led to this moment. The past was no longer something he could outrun. It was here, with him, a constant reminder of everything he had done and everything he had failed to see. He walked to the window and looked out at the city. The lights twinkled in the distance, like stars that had long lost their meaning. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, a man who had once thought himself invincible, powerful, untouchable. But the truth had caught up with him, and there was no escaping it now. The woman had shown him that. She had stripped away the layers of denial and comfort he had surrounded himself with. And now, he was left to face the truth of who he had become. He took a deep breath, the air sharp in his lungs. He wasn't sure what would come next. Maybe nothing would. Maybe he would never find redemption. But one thing was certain. He would never be the same. He turned away from the window, his gaze shifting to the door where she had stood moments ago. Her presence still lingered in the room, but it wasn't threatening anymore. It was something else, something he couldn't quite name. He had been changed, irrevocably, by the encounter. And as he stood there, surrounded by the remnants of his past, he realized that the true weight of life wasn't in wealth or power. It was in the reckoning with oneself. And as he sat down, the realization hit him. This was only the beginning of a new chapter. One where he would finally face the consequences and the ghosts he had long ignored.